Let's start recording. All right, so welcome to the 19th, can you believe it, in this series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. And we are going to talk today about the great Ottoman conqueror, that is Mehmet II, El-Fatıh. The El-Fatıh is just the Turkish rendition of the Arabic word, the conqueror, so it's kind of redundant. But the rules for anybody who is not familiar, and I think we have a couple guests today. The first one is that this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, in religion, in any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'm an amateur and I'm just very interested in this stuff. That said, this is also going to be a secular presentation to the extent that I talk about Islam and Islamic beliefs, Christianity and Christian beliefs, and Judaism and Jewish beliefs. Those are from a secular point of view and are not the perspectives necessarily of the religious people who may hold them. Now, as with any topic, let's be respectful and have a good amount of discourse. And I prefer interactivity. So if you have questions, comments, clarifications, please do interject, cut me off, and we can go on all kinds of different tangents. And what I like to say is that these meetings are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know anyway. And finally, like the other 18 lectures in the series, they are recorded and they are available at Omnicarta, which is Zach's website, and there you can also find them on YouTube. All right. So everybody, I'm sure, missed from last week, the quiz. So let's see what everybody remembers from last week, right? So question number one, what was the result? Sorry? Okay. What was the result of the Battle of Ankara of 1402?
That's D, isn't it?
Exactly, it's D. Timur imprisoned Bayezid I and his son Mustafa in Samarkand, plunging the empire into an 11-year civil war between the sons of Bayezid, right? Answer A is just false. Georgians didn't have that kind of control. B is also false. Black Joseph actually maintained a significant amount of power after this period. In 1402, he was actually fleeing for his life, and he ended up in the Mamluk Sultanate, but he came back to his home in Tabriz in northwestern Iran a little bit afterwards. And number C refers to something that happened in the 1230s. So very different time period. All right, question number two. Which three of the following were key enemies that Murad II faced?
B and F, but I need a third one, right?
Well, between E and F, one of them is right and one of them is wrong.
No, B and F, sorry.
B and F, yeah. And there's one more.
One more. So help me, guys.
Mm-hmm. That's about the time in Skanderbeg, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's B, C, and F, right? Skanderbeg, János Hunyadi, and Ibrahim II Bey of Karaman were the key enemies that Murad II faced. Right? Skanderbeg is operating in Albania. Ibrahim of Karaman is in southern Anatolia, and George Kastrioti is in and János Hunyadi is Hungarian, but he's fighting for a number of Hungarian vassals that are like Serbia, for example, or with the Bulgarians. Stefan Lazarevich, as we mentioned, was a vassal of the Ottomans, so he fought on their side. Sheikh Badruddin had his uprising during the reign of Mehmed I, not Murad II, and Roja de Fleur was during the reign of Osman I, so much earlier in time. All right, question number three. Which of the following Ottoman sultans attempted to besiege Constantinople? Choose all that apply.
Well, I'm sure Mehmed, it was not his first time. I think it was E, and I think A is also. I think Osman tried those. I think.
Okay, one of those is right. The answers are D, E, and F. All three of those sultans tried to besiege Constantinople. The sieges of Bayezid I and Murad II were much more substantive than that of Mehmed I, but all three of them did that. And the reason that Bayezid, Mehmed, and Murad II both did this, is that the Byzantine Empire was supporting the enemies of these states, right? In the case of Bayezid I, the Byzantines reached out to the powers of Europe to have a crusade, which was the crusade at Nicopolis. In the case of Mehmed I, the Byzantines supported his brother, Mustafa, the one who was sent to Samarkand to replace him as Sultan. And after defeating Mustafa, he besieged Constantinople. And Murad II did it for a similar reason, which is that the Byzantines called another crusade, the Crusade at Varna of 1444. And Murad II besieged Constantinople for bringing down the Crusaders on them once more. All three of these sieges were unsuccessful because the Ottomans lacked proper siege technology. All right. And finally, question number 4. How was the Byzantine Empire primarily able to protect itself from the Ottoman attacks in addition to its walls?
C and D looks like.
C is correct. D is wrong. The Byzantines had trade with the Mamluks, but they didn't pay them to fight on their behalf. They did fight. They did pay other Turkic mercenaries that were already in Anatolia, but not the Mamluk Sultanate. So, the Byzantines had a small navy. Most of the naval forces that they had at their disposal were Venetian or Genoese. The Patriarch of Constantinople did not send lots of new priests. In fact, this was one of the major reasons that a lot of people in Anatolia converted from Christianity to Islam, is that they had much more access to the Sufis than they did to learned priests. And as I pointed out, the Byzantines didn't pay the Mamluk Sultanate or Caucasian Emirates to attack the Ottomans. But they did support pretenders, like, as we mentioned, Duzmece Mustafa, and Küçük Mustafa, who was Mehmed I's, Murad I's nephew. Okay. One of the things that we mentioned in our previous sessions was that the eastern part of Anatolia was an area where people had heterodox beliefs, right? They were not truly Sunni Muslims, especially among the more tribal Turkic nomads. And we mentioned the revolution of Baba Ishaq, right? Where you have these Muslims that at least nominally are Muslims under his sort of tutelage, but he's a quasi-divine cultic figure. And he does things that are outside of the realm of typical Islamic belief. We know that he drank wine and his followers drank wine. We have them using a lot of Turkic amulets. We have this, and we also have this cult of personality that's both surrounds him and surrounds Ali, right? That fourth caliph that is incredibly prominent in Shiite Islam. We then talked about how the Ottoman state, when it expanded against the Byzantine Empire, right? Which was very unique in that most of the other beyliks were only surrounded, beyliks or Turkish principalities were only surrounded by other beyliks. But since the Ottoman Empire had the Christians on his northwest side, he was able to conquer them, and a lot more and more territory to his Timariot, or his leading cavalrymen that were then turned into knights of the land, where they had a group of people who would pay rents to them. We then followed that with a discussion of Bayezid I Yıldırım, who fought back the crusade at Nicopolis in 1396, and solidified the position of the Ottoman Empire as both a European empire in what's now Greece and Bulgaria, and an empire in the northwestern side of modern Turkey. But that was thrown haywire by Timur, resulting in the Ottoman interregnum period, which eventually sees Mehmet Çelebi become the next sultan. We talked about how the Byzantines interfered a little bit in the questions, and how the Byzantines expanded at the cost of Venice as well. We mentioned the Karamanids as the largest Turkic enemy of the Ottomans as the Ottomans were expanding. And the Karamanids were closer to the historic heartland of Anatolian Turkish identity. They controlled the city of Konya, right, the holiest city in all of Turkey. And they were, since they were less connected to Europe, they had been less Europeanized than the Ottomans. Also remember that the Ottomans, because they had large numbers of janissaries and officials coming from Europe, there was a strong European contingent within Ottoman government, especially as devshirme began to ramp up during the reigns of Mehmed I and Murad II. So you had this cultural component where the Turks of Karaman could claim that they were more honestly inheritors of the Seljuk sultans and therefore Anatolian Turkdom. We mentioned
excuse me, just wanted to remind me, is in Konya, that's where the Rumi is buried, right?
Yes, that's exactly where Rumi is buried. Yeah. He's buried in the Yeşil Türbe, the green tomb, I guess. And it's still a landmark today in the center of Konya. And Konya was really the place where his teachings really radiated out, right? Which is part of the reason why it became so holy in Turkish minds. So we also mentioned that during the reign of Murad II, he abdicated the throne in 1444. He wanted to go and study with Sufi sheikhs like Jalaluddin Rumi. I mean, Rumi was dead by this point, but sheikhs like him. And he was called back into service later in that year when the Crusade at Varna happened. But let's focus for a second on what happened while Murad II had abdicated. When he abdicated, his son, who was 14, right, Mehmet II, that little boy, basically became the most powerful Turkic lord in the world. And in order to guide his policy, you had Chandarlı Halil, who is the man seated on the right-hand side. Chandarlı Halil was one of the former beys, these sort of princes from these Turkish principalities, and his ancestors had made peace with the Ottoman expansion. They gave up their lands, but in exchange for giving up their lands, they became the chief viziers of the Ottoman state, which made them second only to the Sultan in terms of how much power they wielded at the court. And Chandarlı Halil felt that at 14 years old, Mehmed II was not capable of ruling. He nullified many of Mehmed II's decisions and convinced Mehmet to return the throne to Murad II, to allow Murad II to take back power, which his father did. And his father again ruled from 1444 until 1451, where he took care of the Crusade at Varna, defeated the Polish king Vladislav III, and his coalition of Austrian, Hungarian, and Serbian forces. which leads us to the point where Murad II dies. He had effectively stopped the crusade, and now Mehmet II comes to power, and he believes that it is his destiny to take Constantinople, right? So he's 21 at this point. So he's still quite young. You can sort of see in the painting that almost all the soldiers look older than he does, right? He's the one wearing that red flowing robe and seated upon the horse. His famous quote, of course, is, I will take Constantinople or she will take me, right? In the sense of he will have to besiege it. There's no other way. And given how young he was, many in the Ottoman court disagreed with this desire to take Constantinople. For Mehmet II himself, he considered it as his birthright and a necessity, and we're going to also talk about how he saw it in Islamic terms. But the first thing that he did when he came to power was that he wanted to settle the situation with Ibrahim II of Karaman. As we mentioned during the quiz, Ibrahim of Karaman was one of the enemies of Murad II and had opposed his expansion into Anatolia. So Mehmet II realized that he would have to make peace with him in order to secure his frontier. And so in 1451, he did that. He reached out to Ibrahim Bey. The question that's, of course, on the minds of many in this group, no, that is not a Jewish star. That is actually the flag of Karaman. And it just happens to be the same shape and the same color. They are devout Muslims. Chandali Halil, even with making peace with the Bey of Karaman, Chandali Halil, the Grand Vizier, was very much against Mehmet's decision to move against Constantinople and repeatedly argued with him over this decision. So if Mehmet II didn't like Chandali Halil for how he treated him as a 14-year-old, he certainly didn't like how he was treating him now that he was unequivocally going to be the future sultan. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire had recently seen their next emperor come to power in Constantinople, and that was Emperor Constantine the 11th. Emperor Constantine was able to travel to Europe and petitioned once more for another crusade. But because of struggles between Western European states at the time, combined with a general apathy from the Hungarians, given how the last two crusades had gone, his call fell on deaf ears. He also promised that he would convert to Catholicism, that he would end the schism between the church, between the Orthodox Church in the East and the Catholic Church in the West, if the Crusades would come. And he very publicly converted. However, the majority of the Greek patriarchs in Constantinople, as well as the rank and file, actually are reported to have said quotes like, "We would prefer the Ottoman turban to a bishop's mitre," right? In that they would prefer to stay Orthodox Christians than to convert to Catholicism to save their city. Now, when it comes to Mehmed II, we should also talk about how he grew up and what kind of person he was. He was an extremely cultured person. He's reputed to speak between 7 and 11 languages. He visited Europe on multiple occasions. He was considered a darling in numerous European courts. In fact, he managed to maintain decent relations with nearly every European power other than the Byzantines. And even the Venetians, who he went to war with from time to time, still held him in quite great respect. So on the right-hand side, you can see one of the earliest portraits that we have of an Ottoman Sultan, right? Because almost all of the portraits that we have of Ottoman Sultans who came before were renditions done long after they died, or were done as miniatures, right? The Persian style of drawing, which is much closer to what we see in the middle for Ali Kushchu. But this is a European style, more photorealistic portrait of Mehmed II. And it was done by Gentile Bellini when he was in Constantinople. in the 1480s, which was toward the end of Mehmed II's life. Ali Kushçu actually connects East and West. He was an astronomer in Ulugberg's astronomy tower. Ulugberg was the leader of the Timurids based in Samarkand at this time, and was and while not as effective of a ruler as his father Shahrukh or his grandfather Timur, he was quite a gifted scientist, especially when it came to astronomy, physics, and calculations. And so Ali Kushçu was in Samarkand, and Mehmed II invited him to come to Turkey in order to teach Turkish scientists and astronomers how to better apply their craft, right? So Mehmed II clearly valued the arts and sciences in this way. I also wanted to talk about Sufi Sheikh Akhshameddin. You can see Akhshameddin on the left-hand side. He was a Sufi scholar, and he was Mehmed's primary teacher when he was a child, teaching him especially in the Islamic arts, to the extent that the previous Ottoman sultans were somewhere between Tengrism, Sufism, and jurisprudential Sunni Islam. Mehmed II becomes really the first Ottoman sultan who is clearly Sunni Muslim in the bounds of orthodox thinking. And Sheikh Akhshameddin is part of the reason why that happened. And this was also where Mehmed II got his idea that he needed to conquer Constantinople, because in several of the hadiths, there is a prophecy that eventually the Muslims will conquer Constantinople, and then after that, they will conquer Rome. So Mehmed II believed that he was fulfilling this prophecy in preparing to attack Constantinople, and we'll actually see at the end of his life, he even tries to make his way towards Rome. But Mehmed II was not just a religious person, a scientific person, a linguistic person. He was also very much interested in the arts, and he wrote numerous what were called ghazal, or poetic structure. Ghazal is the name of the poetic structure, similarly to the word sonnet or epic, right? It's a poetic structure, and he wrote a number of ghazal under the pseudonym Avni, and so some of his ghazal are incredibly romantic. This one is him looking at a beautiful male and being seduced by this man. It's not clear if he ever performed any gay acts, but we do know that Ottoman sultans, especially after him, did have gay sex. And so it was in the Ottoman Empire legal for homosexual activities to occur, despite it being an Islamic prohibition. So, and as you can see, if you can read the line, those who have seen Galata, their hearts will not be bound to paradise. After seeing his heart-pleasing figure, they will forget about all finest cypresses. And of course, the his here is not referring to the district of Galata, which is in the first sentence. It's referring to the man that he's pining after, who happens to live in the district of Galata. Any questions? All right, then. So in order to prepare for...
Richard,
yeah.
Just a quick one. By any chance, do you know what their astronomy was? Was it Ptolemaic, geocentric, or heliocentric, or was it just calendrical? Any idea what they were doing?
I don't know if I don't believe I think if you press them, they would say that they were geocentric. I don't think they really. I don't think it was really a question that concerned them as much. They were much more interested with the positions of the stars, the quality of those stars, like were they bright, were they not, when did they show up in the year. They were worried about calendrical positioning. They were worried about orientation towards Mecca, of course, and they were interested in spatial phenomena, things like nebula, constellations, stuff like that. So I don't really think that was a question that they were really interested in asking, but to the extent that they asked it, I think they would have fallen on the geocentric side.
Yep, thanks.
So this is obviously a map of modern Constantinople, and the city is massive. So it's actually expanded far beyond the borders of the original city. But if you look very closely inside the circle on the left-hand side, that is the district of Sultan Ahmet in modern Istanbul. And that's also the area where the old walled city is. If I go forward a few slides, you can see more clearly, right, the old walled city when there's nothing around it. So when I go back, you can sort of compare those two shapes, right? Now, so that's the old city of Constantinople. In order to begin to besiege it, Mehmed II wanted to be sure that no boats would come from the north, that no boats would come from the Black Sea. And so he decided to make a new castle on the European side of the Bosphorus, right? The one on the Asian side, Anadolu Hisarı, was already built by Sultan Bayezid I and marked the outer limit of Ottoman control, right? Because the Ottomans controlled the eastern side of the Bosphorus. They just didn't control the western side of the Bosphorus. And with their lack of effective ships, they couldn't prevent the Genoese, Venetians, and others who had much better ships from passing through, with only controlling the eastern side of the Bosphorus. But the Sultan Mehmet sent an advance guard to the western side of the Bosphorus, and within the space of a year and a half, he actually built what you can see there as Rumeli Hisarı, the Rumelian castle, right? Because as we remember, Rumelia was the term that Ottomans used to refer to southeastern Europe, what we would call the Balkans today. So, right, you have Anadolu Hisarı, the Anatolian castle, and Rumeli Hisarı, the Rumelian castle. Of course, these two castles have now become national patrimony of the Turkish government. And with these two castles literally facing each other right across the Bosphorus, it was able to prevent any ships from coming from the north, and also secure a clear route for the Ottomans to cross into Europe without having to go all the way around Eastern Thrace. So at the same time, after building these two castles to allow for travel from Bursa, right, over to the European side, you also have the Ottomans advancing from the European side, from Rumelia, into the Ottoman Empire. As you can see from the map in the upper right-hand side, right, the Byzantine Empire really only controls the area around Constantinople and a little bit to its west, right, that area of Eastern Thrace. And so Sultan Mehmet took his forces and gathered them in Rumelia, because, of course, in Rumelia you have the largest number of Timariot, right? Those Timar holding knights. So he was able to gather the largest force there, and he began marching on castles controlled by the Byzantines. The first castle he took was Vize Castle. Then he moved close to the coast and took Silivri Castle before eventually coming to Constantinople. And so as he took each of these castles, he further reduced the Byzantine Empire and was able to form a direct defense on the land side, on the European land side, against the Byzantines. At the same time, Mehmed II realizes that he's going to need a navy if he wants to prevent supplies from reaching the city from the Venetians and Genoese, and also if he wants to bring over forces from the Anatolian side. And so he begins his first navy. One of the things to notice on this map also is that you can see, for example, Morea and Athens are also in that purple, because those are also territories of the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire was not one unitary thing, but it was a number of specific parts that simply had not been taken by the Ottoman Empire yet. Okay. So when we come to Constantinople, now we have to notice that the land walls of Theodosius are an incredibly complex system. And you can see sort of a front side view and a side view on the left-hand side of the screen. So at first there's a moat that's 60 meters across. Then there is a first wall, and then a second higher wall with guard posts, and then there's the city. And these walls were incredibly impressive. That's the reason why Bayezid I, Mehmed I, and Murad II could not break these walls. Without proper siege equipment, they're practically impregnable. Now, Mehmed II had an advantage that none of the other sultans had, which was that the city of Constantinople was severely depopulated by this point. For those who know Roman history, the city of Constantinople at that time had over 500,000 people. It may well have even had 1 million people. Hello? Okay. It may well have had up to 1 million people. But at this point, the city is estimated to have a population of around 50,000 people and only around 7,000 to 10,000 defenders. By contrast, because he's been pulling all these troops from Rumelia and because he's been pulling all these troops from Anatolia, Mehmed II has between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers at his disposition. So he either has 2 or 3 times the number of soldiers than the entire population of the city. And there are huge sections of Constantinople that are either underpopulated or not populated at all. One other thing to notice is that there are the 2 districts, right? There's the Horn, which is the majority of the city that sort of looks like a horn. And then on the northern side, across that little bit of water, is Galata, which is that district where the handsome man came from, right? And Galata was not protected by the Great Walls, the Great Land Walls. I have a question as to why it was unpopulated. There are a few reasons why Constantinople was underpopulated. One was that it was constantly under siege. That's not a great way to live. Number 2 was the Fourth Crusade, right, where you had all this, where Constantinople became the heart of Western Christian Frankish state between 1204 and 1261. We also had the Black Death come through in the 1350s. So between all of that instability, all of these different invasions, the city's population decreased dramatically. But back to Galata. So it doesn't have the protection of the land walls, but it is still part of the city of Constantinople. And if you look closely, there was the Great Chain. So so it's actually a set of interlocking metal pieces like a chain, and it's stretched across that small waterway, and that chain, when risen, would prevent any boats from getting from the Bosphorus side in the east into that inlet river, where they could then attack the sea walls, which were much less built up than the land walls. So the Byzantines had still maintained this chain, and when they raised it, it meant that the Ottoman ships would be unable to get to the sea walls because the chain was functionally impregnable, given how dense the metal was and Ottoman naval craft at the time. Okay, so Mehmed II.
Richard, just a second. You may have said this and I missed it. Why could they not undermine or do something about disable the chain from the Galata side, since that was much less well defended and they controlled everything to the north there?
Sure, Galata still has walls, so in theory it could be besieged. The thing is that Mehmed II didn't want to actually run a siege on Galata, specifically because the dominant population in Galata was the Genoese, and the Genoese had been the historic sea allies of the Ottoman Empire, coming and going. It wasn't a perfect alliance, but if push came to shove, they would prefer that the Genoese were on favorable relations with them, so that way they could use them against the Venetians. So Mehmed II didn't want to besiege Galata and take it by force, and the Genoese were certainly not going to
lower the chain as long as they were part of the Byzantine Empire, because they had exclusive trading privileges with the Byzantines that they wanted to keep. They'd prefer those than being under the Ottomans, but at the same time, yeah.
But didn't the Genovese are the ones who actually supplied the troops for the defense anyway, right?
Yes, but the thing is that the Ottomans thought that if they needed a bigger sea force, if it turned into a sea battle, then maybe they could convince the Genoese to switch sides, and they knew for certain that if they besieged Galata, that wouldn't happen. So they were willing to let the chain stand in order to avoid that possibility.
Okay.
That was the thought process. But actually, if you look at this picture of the Navy very closely, you can see that they're actually dragging the ships overland. And this is actually how they got around the chain. They actually dragged the ships over that area to the north of Galata, where you can see the small encampment. They found a way. But the biggest issue, of course, was the land wall. So because Mehmed II wanted to take the city, so he decided to find whatever could be used to take down the wall. And so he found a mechanic, I guess you could say, a cannoneer named Orban from Hungary. And Orban had originally sold his design of cannons to the Byzantine Empire, but the cost that it would take to make the cannon was cost prohibitive to the Byzantines, and also they couldn't find a use for it. So they turned him down and expelled him. And so Orban went to the Ottomans because money is money. And the Ottomans paid him for his design and had 3 made. And the gun was called Shahi Topu, which has been termed in English as the Dardanelles gun, because it was stored in the Dardanelles before it was given to the English by a later Turkish sultan. So the Dardanelles gun is the name that it came to in English. But this gun was incredibly massive. It took 60 oxen to pull this thing from the places where it was produced. It was primarily produced outside of Thessaloniki. No, sorry, it was either Thessaloniki or Edirne. Edirne probably makes more sense because it's closer. But it took 60 oxen to drag this thing, and it could only be fired 3 to 5 times a day because of how hot the metal got of the actual cannon, and it would need to be wiped out and thoroughly cleaned between every shot. The heat and difficulty of maintaining the cannon also resulted in one of the cannons exploding, which killed Orban while he was maintaining it. But this cannon was able to blow holes in the walls, but even that was not necessarily successful in taking the walls down, because with the slow reload time, the Greeks behind the walls were able to refortify and redevelop their position. So while the cannons are certainly the most impressive part of the Ottoman forces in taking down the land wall, it doesn't deserve all the credit.
There you go. Thank you so much. Okay. I very much appreciate it.
So as you can see, the way that I wish I could find this in English. I only found it in Turkish. But you can see here, this is how the Ottomans got their position together. So you can see that on the 20th of April, the Ottoman fleet came to the Horn and they saw the chain. And on the 22nd of April, in the morning, they started carrying the boats across, and between 67 and 70 boats were brought overland to the other side of the chain so they could attack the seawalls. At the same time, in early April, the Sultan set up his camp on the northwest side, where Chandarli Halil and Saruja Pasha would organize the forces. And by and they eventually brought the trebuchets from a number of different districts to besiege the city. So, of course, this has been mythologized and eulogized by Turkish historians who argue that at this point, in front of the city, Mehmet II and all of his soldiers prayed for victory in the name of Allah against the city. Whether or not he actually prayed in front of the walls is subject to historical dispute. But again, he was a pious person and believed that his mission to take the city was sanctioned by God, regardless of whether he actually did that. So while the siege was going on, you can see different pictures of Turkish forces at the wall. You have the Janissaries with their famous white tops to their hats. You have the ordinary soldiers and the Sipahi as well. And you have the large-scale guns, the cannonade that we talked about earlier, the Shahi Topu. At the same time, the Greeks had, the Byzantines did have Greek fire, which they had put on the walls. And so when the besiegers tried to go up the walls, they poured fire on them. The siege lasted 57 days. But eventually, between the guns and the overwhelming force that the Sultan had brought to bear, the walls were broken and the troops entered into the city. At this point, there was a massive debate between Chandarla Halil on the one side and Zagamenos, who was another chief aide, on the other side. And they were arguing about whether or not the Turks should have the right to pillage the city.
Richard, can I ask a question before we go on? Because you mentioned something that Greece was still part of Byzantine Empire, and
Morea, yeah.
I was wondering. I know Genovese participated, but did they provide defense support for the city?
As far as I know, there were no Genoese combatants.
No, Genoese. No, not Genoese. As far as I know, there were. I mean, there were Genoese. There was a contingent, but I was asking about Greece, not Genoese.
Oh, sorry. I've been using the word Greek and Byzantine interchangeably. I should be more careful. We're talking about Byzantines.
Yeah, but is the mainland Greece? I'm talking about Peloponnesus and Attica. Were they independent? Were they under Byzantine Empire?
They were part of the Byzantine Empire, but they were not sending soldiers to Constantinople to buttress it. They were afraid for Ottomans on their own flank, and the Ottomans would invade Morea within the decade.
Yeah, okay, so they did not send anything. Yeah, that seems to be strange. This was such an important battle. All right.
So I think it's just a question of distance and accessibility, but so Zagamenos and Chandarla Halil debated whether or not to invade the city, and if they invaded the city, how much, whether the Turkic troops who had been amassed would be allowed to pillage it. Because remember, historically, that was one of the key ways you paid soldiers, was their ability to pillage from the cities that they conquered. And Mehmed II agreed to allow the Turkish troops under Zagamenos' recommendation, because he couldn't stand Chandarla Halil and later had him executed, that he would allow them to pillage for 3 days before coming into the city to stop them. So we have numerous renditions from the Greek side of massacres, rapes, and all kinds of malfeasance being done by Turkish troops once they had broken through and come into Constantinople. When Mehmet did enter the city, he immediately ordered all of the violence to cease. Whether or not it ceased immediately is again, a question of historical contention, but it seems more or less that it did. Mehmet II then went to Hagia Sophia, which of course was the holiest church in all of Eastern Christianity, and proceeded to make it into a mosque. In order to do that, though, all of the frescoes in the Hagia Sophia had to be covered, because according to Islamic precept, a person cannot a Muslim cannot pray in a building with images of people emblazoned on it. So he covered them with lime and a thin coating, and declared it a mosque. Now, there's a scene from a Turkish movie called Mehmet the Conqueror on the lower right-hand side, where Mehmet is inside the Hagia Sophia, and he finds the Christians that have been holed up inside. In the movie, Mehmet II tells them that they are now his subjects too, and that they have nothing to fear. We have no evidence that Mehmet gave a speech like that to the Christian subjects, at least not at this point. We will see it when we go to Bosnia, that he gave a speech similar to that. But at this point, he demanded that the church be turned into a mosque. But he didn't exile the Christian population of the city. He allowed them to stay in the city and began to build other populations in the city.
Richard, quick question.
Yeah.
When I was in Istanbul, there was also the reason that, maybe as a question or a comment, I don't know, whichever you choose, there was a reason that he only covered the Christian artifacts because of the
frescoes.
Yeah, the frescoes.
Frescoes, yeah.
The artifacts he had removed.
Because of his respect to his, so to speak, you can't call her a stepmother, but the harem mother, so to speak, the Serbian, I forget her name is, but he respected her so much, and she was Christian. There was a fact that he was a little bit more cosmopolitan, or so to speak, more enlightened sultan, and therefore he didn't erase them completely. So there's this respect. Also, the second point is, I'm sure you're going to come to that, is when they built the Blue Mosque, because of him being so young when he was the sultan, they built extra minarets in the Blue Mosque that they had to supplement that in Mecca, with building one more in Mecca, because of the fact that they built one more than in Mecca in Istanbul. I don't know if you know any of that facts. Sorry.
No, that's actually really interesting. It does make sense. But yeah, no, that wasn't originally going to be part of my presentation, but I think it's really cool to add. All right. So when Mehmet was redesigning Istanbul, we have to remember, right, that he's dealing with a city with large empty spaces, which gives any person the ability to really rewrite the canvas. And the first thing that, of course, he does is he commissions the building of a palace in 1459, so only 6 years later. And Topkapi Saraya, or Topkapi Palace, in the eastern part of the Horn. You can actually see it in the modern picture. If you see sort of that area that's green at the easternmost edge of Istanbul, that's where Topkapi Palace is. And so he builds that palace, and that becomes the seat of Ottoman authority until the late 1700s, when it moves to Dolmabahce Palace in Beyoğlu district. But this is the palace of Suleiman. This is the palace of many of Selim the Grim. And this is the palace, if you play Assassin's Creed Revelations, this is the palace that you're jumping around in. In fact, most of the city that you see in that video game is the city designed by Mehmet II, even though you're playing at the time when his son Bayezid II is ruling. Now, one of the interesting things, or sad things, probably better to say, that we see in the Ottoman period, and it's exemplified by Mehmet, but he's not the only one who did it, was that populations were forcibly transferred all across the empire. So if you look at the map on the left-hand side, all of those black circles, including the one in Crimea, in the ones in northern Serbia, all of these dots represent population centers that were forcibly expelled and moved to Constantinople to create districts in Constantinople that would be the finest in whatever that ethnicity produces. So he created a Greek district, he created an Armenian district, he created a Jewish district, he brought even Muslims from conquered cities like Aksaray in Anatolia because they were good with pottery. And he built these districts inside of Istanbul, many of those districts becoming very much associated with the aristocracy of whatever that ethnic or religious group was. Probably the most famous example is the Fener district, which is in the northern part of the Horn and was where Greek Orthodox primarily lived. And that district gave rise to the Fanariote, who were the leaders of the Greek Orthodox Church for all of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is sort of the beginning of the millet system. It won't be identified as the millet system until the 1800s in clear and precise language. But at this point, Mehmet II appoints 3 individuals to be the head of the religious minority communities. And these are the 3 recognized religious minorities. You have the Rum, right, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and the Jews. And so the first the first Greek to be appointed was the patriarch within Constantinople. That was Gennadius II, Scholarios. And he was based out of the Fener district, as I mentioned. We have the first Jewish Hahambashi, right? The chief Haham, the chief wise man in Hebrew. And that was Eli Kapsali. But Eli Kapsali died in 1454. And so his brother Moses Kapsali became the Hahambashi for for over 4 decades. And finally, the Armenians were represented by their own Millet-Bashi, their head of the nation, Hovakim I, who was deported from the eastern regions of the Ottoman Empire to Istanbul, and became the first leader of that in 1461. So a little bit later, but still within the reign of Mehmet II. But it wasn't just these 3 religious communities that Mehmet II recognized and built up. He renewed the terms of the Genoese and in Galata and the Venetians in the Horn to continue their trade, but their trade was now at the Sultan's disposition. Before they had very special trading terms under the Byzantines, they had their own independent governance, but now they had to pay taxes to the Sultan, and they were there at the Sultan's pleasure.
Richard, just one more point. The
Sure.
famous cistern that they have when Mehmed II came in, and the Muslim religion, you're not allowed to conserve water and keep it there in a cistern, and they had to actually drag the mountain water, because before each namaz or each of the prayer, they had to have a clear water that shouldn't be contained in a cistern. So they dried that cistern up, and now it's one of the famous parts of the Constantinople or Istanbul. When you visit, that cistern, it just it looks a little spooky. You go inside, and it has all the columns from Byzantine, but it used to be water that used to conserve for the whole population of Istanbul or Byzantium, and they dried that well up. Sorry.
Absolutely.
This is a Galata Tower, right? Oh, on the
Yeah.
previous one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same Galata Tower. I'd put it there because it would remind me of the Genoese.
Right.
So
yeah, it was built before they took in the 14th century.
It was built in the Byzantine period.
Yeah.
I believe it was built in the 1200s.
So they
Or
also,
1200s.
I thought it was like mid 14th century. That's what I thought.
Oh, it could be. Yeah.
Richard, have you heard of this famous Genovese mercenary Antoniani that was hired by the Komnenos, or the emperor? He was pretty, well depicted in the series.
Right. Giustiniani.
Giustiniani, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, he had 700 Genovese contingent. Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm not that familiar, unfortunately. But yeah, so after that, Mehmed II marched north. We remember that Stefan Lazarevich was the vassal of Bayezid I, but as soon as Bayezid I was removed by Timur, I have a comment about collected water being an issue. The issue is that the cistern of Justinian wasn't clean enough. So it's like modern reservoirs and cisterns are not an issue. The reservoir of Justinian doesn't work for that. I mean, if there was no possibility of using cisterns at all, most of the Middle East would be barren at this point, because it's very rare that you find water springs in most of the areas of the Middle East. So it's about the purity of the water in the cisterns. So in 1402, right, when Bayezid I lost to Timur, the Serbians declared independence once again as their own despotate. And in order to fight back and retake Serbia, Mehmed II sent his military against Belgrade. Belgrade was defended by that Hungarian János Hunyadi in the name of the Serbians, and he defeated Mehmed II. It was probably Mehmed's biggest and most decisive defeat. But unfortunately for the Serbians, their key ruler, Đurađ Branković, who you can see on the right-hand side, died shortly after this. He died, the siege was in 1454 and 1455. He died, I believe, in 1456 or 1457, one of those two. There was a war of succession, but eventually the entire line just broke. And Mehmed II conquered Belgrade and Smederevo, the two major fortresses of the despotate, and ended the existence of an independent Serbia. You can see in the picture a miniature of the Ottoman siege of the city. The Ottomans had more advanced weaponry and larger numbers than the Serbs could bring to bear. So it was a miracle that János Hunyadi was able to defeat them, but that defeat only bought the Serbians 5 more years of independence. Now, I'm going to come to the Asian side a little bit later, because I feel like it's better to just not keep flip-flopping between Europe and Asia. But just at this point, Mehmed II has brought a lot of his soldiers over to the Asian side to deal with some of the conquests in Asia. So one of his vassal states, which was Wallachia, modern Romania, decided to revolt under their ruler, Vlad III Țepeș. And Țepeș was also known as Vlad Dracul, or Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler. There are a lot of different names for who he is and what he did. And he ruled from an area very close to the princely court, which you can see in the upper left-hand side. So he decided to attack the Ottoman position in what's called the Battle with Torches. And Mehmed II was so enraged that he sent his army back from Asia. The conquest had actually finished, but he sent his army back from Asia to march
into the territory of Romania. And when he got there, he saw all the former Turkish officials that had been there during this time that Romania was a vassal, that Wallachia was a vassal, and there was just an entire forest of impaled Turkish leaders. And Mehmed II was just in awe of how barbarous this was. It didn't stop him though. He got to the capital and removed Vlad III and placed his brother Radu III Tsarfromos, Radu III the Handsome, onto the throne. It's not entirely clear why Vlad had such a negative attitude towards Turks that he would treat them this way. Some believe it's because when he was a child, we know that while he was a child, he was in the Ottoman court, and he was raised in the Ottoman court, as was the case of many of the vassal states' children. And so he spoke fluent Turkish. He had a number of Turkish friends, but when he became leader of Wallachia, he had a very negative attitude against the Turks. Some of it could be the Christian religion. Some of it could be negative experiences that he had as a child in Istanbul, and in Edirne. So we don't know. Where this animosity came from. So, but because of his penchant for this kind of violence and torture, the myth of Dracula really circulated around his person.
They actually said that as an interesting fact. When he was in prison, he was so bored he would impale rats. So he was quite sycophantic on his own. But they do look at him as an independence fighter in Romania and Moldova at this point.
Absolutely, because his action was Turks get out, right? Like he didn't stop until they left, but they didn't. But they came back. So, and they were more powerful than he was. After this, Mehmed II turned his attention towards Bosnia, which was an independent state, another despotate at the time. When he conquered Bosnia, he decided to build a garrison in the center of the region, and that garrison became Sarajevo. So the city of Sarajevo was actually an Ottoman city. There was settlement in the area before, but it was not anything close to a city. It was not centrally organized. And he planted the seed of Tsareva Jamia, the king's mosque, which the version you can see there is a rebuilt version, unfortunately, because earthquakes and other things destroyed the original version. But that is the same place, and it is the same mosque that Mehmed II built in terms of the location and centrality. And when Mehmed II conquered Bosnia, he was asked about how he should treat the Franciscans, right? Because there was a Catholic contingent in the city. And he published this firman, or Ottoman edict or charter. And in the charter, you can read the specifics if you look more closely, but generally, he says that religious freedom is part of what these people shall live with. Nobody will harm the men or the women, regardless of what faith they practice. The churches will be protected, and that people have the same rights, which is probably the closest you'll have to a declaration of freedom of religion within any state prior to the modern era. This, of course, did not stop the practice of devshirme, of the child levy, where young children would be sold into slavery. Young Balkan children would be sold into slavery. And these territories, such as taking Bosnia, added to the number of children who would be brought in through Devshirme, which gained Mehmed II more prestige at court because the children of the Devshirme tended to prefer Mehmet over more Anatolian-oriented sultans. But at the same time, those who were not part of the levy, those who had their faith, would only have to pay a tax and they would be protected.
Rich, not to throw it's not a really any kind of incite, any kind of hatred, but there is a notion out there that prior to conquest of Bosnia, most of the population was Serbians, and the Serbians then became Bosniaks, or they took on Islam religion and became Bosnian Muslims, but they originally were Serbians, so to speak. There's a notion like that. I don't know. Obviously, I don't want to.
No, that's it's partially inaccurate in the sense that some of them were Christians. Some of them were Catholics. Otherwise, there would be no Franciscan church, right, in Bosnia. But no, they are correct that if you wind the clock back to the year, let's say 1400, you have no Muslim population in what's now Bosnia. Maybe you have the random merchant or the foreign visitor, but in terms of indigenous population, Bosnia was, for all intents and purposes, 99% Christian, maybe 1% Jewish, right? You're not seeing a Muslim contingent there. And the creation of the Bosniak, or the Muslim of Yugoslav ancestry, is a development because of the Ottoman Empire's position in holding Bosnia from 1464 until it was taken by the Hungarians in 1905. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1905. So yes, the Serbians are correct in that the Bosniaks are a creation of the Ottoman Empire, but you could make the same argument about the Serbians themselves, right? The fact that they're Orthodox is only because the Orthodox Church was founded in the city of Peć in what's now Kosovo. And that Serbian Orthodox Church organized the Serbian people into one Orthodox Christian group. And before that, they were the Roman religion. So it just depends on how far you want to turn the clock back.
And before that, they were pagan. And before that, they worshipped animals.
They were scraping lichen off rocks.
Yeah, and they threw rocks at each other, right? I mean,
but ethnically, we know Bosnians are Slavs, but were they are all the Bosniaks converted to Islam? Are there any Bosnians who are Christians, or that would be Serbs?
Okay, there's sort of two things that we sort of have to disentangle here. You have Croatian, Bosnian, and Serbian, which refer to passports, right, and national boundaries. And you have Croat, Bosniak, and Serb, which refer to ethnicities.
Yeah,
right?
I was talking about that ethnicity.
Right. So in Bosnia, the country, you have Bosnian Croats, Bosnian Bosniaks, and Bosnian Serbs. And those three different groups are the different religious delineations, but neither is more Bosnian than the other.
So the Bosniaks are the Slavs that are Islam, that have Islamic religion, right?
There may be some Turkic interbreeding, but it's minimal.
Yeah, because I mean, then is there any difference, ethnic difference between Bosniaks and Serbs? Was the Bosniak existed before Islam?
No, before Islam there were only two groups. There were Croats and Serbs.
Okay, so Bosniaks. Okay, I get
right. And the only distinction between Croats and Serbs is religion. So
the church,
right. Yeah, there were Catholic Croats, Catholics, and the others.
Right. But if we had this magic gun, for want of a better term, and we just shot everybody in Bosnia with this gun, and this gun just wiped away their religious consciousness, right? Like everything else about them stays the same. We hit them with this gun, and they suddenly forget what religion they are,
right?
And then we did a DNA test on all these people.
it would be very difficult for us to say which one is which. Now, there is a certain aspect to which, now that these identities have existed for 500 years, there's a certain degree of endogamy. And so we could say that there are some traits that perhaps belong to one group. Or if we did a linguistic test, there are some words that Bosniaks use that Serbs don't use, and that Serbs use that Croats don't use, even though their languages are mutually intelligible. But think about it the same way like British English and American English, right?
Yeah. It's all normative. That's all it is.
Right. So the Bosniaks would be the group of maybe Serbs and maybe Croats as well, those that are converted to Islam, right?
Exactly.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
So just to make sure I followed this correctly, when somebody says Bosnian Serb, they mean the Bosniak?
Yes, Bosniaks.
No. Bosnian Serb, they mean a person of Serbian ethnicity inside the country of Bosnia.
Exactly.
Right. Who is Christian?
That's not the same thing as a Bosniak.
A Bosniak with the K at the end refers to a person of Slavic Muslim ethnicity, right? And there are Bosniaks in Bosnia. They're the largest plurality of population there. But there are also Bosniaks in the country of Serbia. Those are Serbian Bosniaks.
And in Kosovo.
And in Kosovo.
Yep.
Right? Because Kosovo, the majority is Muslim Albanians, but there are also Muslim Slavs. And those Muslim Slavs are Bosniaks, and the Orthodox Christian Slavs are Serbs, right? So Kosovo also has a Serbian minority, a Serb minority.
And that was a big issue with the KLA like 20 years ago, is that they have that sort of blood and earth BS around, who's a pure member of KLA versus who's a Bosniak version. It's all this,
Yeah, but they're all Slavs versus the Albanians who are Illyrians, who are like ethnically and very different, right?
The Albanians are what ethnically?
They are Illyrians.
Albanians are their own ethnicity. Albanians aren't Slavs.
They're more earlier than Slavs. Slavs moved about like maybe 6th century, but these are the original kind of before Slavs population. Now, Illyrians,
So it's not my imagination, though, that these terms are kind of confusing if you're not super familiar with this history.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it as simple as I can.
No, I'm not blaming you. This is an experience of my life trying to make sense of it 20 and 30 years ago. But I'm understanding that it would have been hard even then to make sense of it.
Well, what happened 20 to 30 years ago, right? You're talking about the Bosnian War.
Exactly.
What you had is a civil war in the country of Bosnia between Bosniaks and Croats. I'm doing this as simplistically as I can. Bosniaks and Croats on one side, right? That's Catholics and Muslims, against the Serbs, who were Orthodox. And the reason that the civil war existed is that the Serbs wanted to keep Bosnia united with Serbia, the two countries together, and the Croats and Bosniaks wanted Bosnia to be independent.
Yep.
Okay.
So that was the fight.
Terminologies of the various populations it's okay that it's a little confusing to me.
Absolutely.
Of course. It's like Russia and Ukraine right now.
Well, times like
Russia and Ukraine is two parties. This is three.
No, but it's true. But the idea is the same, that the Russians wants to keep Ukraine and Ukraine wants to be independent.
That part I get. It's the populations that I have trouble like sorting out.
Yeah. Well, because there was a commingling for so long.
Exactly.
And it was actually a design commingling for about 50 years under Tito, right? That was like
very similar to what you would have like in warfare, where they go, like a genocidal, where they rape and pillaging are part of polluting the races. I don't know. I shouldn't use the word
religion maybe.
Yes, exactly. Mixing the bloods, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I also have a question in the comments that's asking, what do the Bogomils have to do with this? And I just wanted to quickly address Bogomilism didn't really exist at this point in time. It was really before Christianity became a dominant religion in the region. That would have been the ancestral religion. When I said pagan, I was referring to Bogomilism because I didn't want to cause confusion, but you asked, so that's what that is. There weren't a lot of Bogomils when the Ottomans invaded.
But no, the history of Yugoslavia is actually really interesting in terms of what Tito and before him, the kings of Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia was a kingdom in the interwar period, and what the kings of Yugoslavia tried to do to prevent the creation of ethnic consciousness in Yugoslavia. One of the things is that the kings actually designed the provinces in a way that would try to make all the provinces ethnically mixed. In order to prevent them from developing a consciousness. The provinces were redesigned by Tito to closer match the ethnicities, but not perfectly. And there were some, like Slovenia or Macedonia, where the borders that Tito designed were more or less exactly where the ethnicity ended. But when it came to Bosnia, you really couldn't do it because Bosnia was just so thoroughly integrated. And if you had created a Bosniak state, it would look like an island archipelago, but a completely landlocked island archipelago, because of the areas where Muslims were the majority were generally cities and small areas around cities, and some areas of the countryside, but more towards the cities. So you had a lot of Serbs in the countryside, so it wouldn't have worked out very well.
So that was part of the horror of that era. Then it's like, because that mixing didn't work, all of a sudden you had neighbors like turning against literal neighbors turning against literal neighbors.
Well,
right?
It depends on who you ask, right? I think most Yugoslavs, if you ask them, regardless of whether they're Croat, Bosniak, or Serb, most Yugoslavs would tell you that the life under Tito was much better than the late 90s and early aughts, when all these countries finally had independence.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
So the mixing would have been better. The difference in the issue is that whenever you have a revolution in power, because Tito didn't effectively set up a state that would long survive his loss. Whenever you have that sort of development, and you have people who are proposing a new order versus the old order, there are different benefits to different people under these different systems. And I think the Serbs were afraid of losing the political power that they had by being the dominant party in Yugoslavia if Bosnia became independent, because in Bosnia, they are not the largest constituent group, but they are significant. They're around 30%. So
Thank you for shedding light on that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And we often talk about the crimes that the Serbs committed, and they did commit genocides and crimes in the Bosnian War. But if you read the stuff from the Croat and Bosniak side, they don't come out smelling like roses either. They just happen to be less capable of doing the kinds of atrocities that the Serbs were capable of doing. Okay. So we mentioned Skanderbeg in the time of Murad II, but he outlasted Murad II, right? And Skanderbeg was in charge of this League of Ledja, this group of Albanian states, right? We mentioned just a few minutes ago that Albanians are not Slavs. They're another indigenous population to this part of Europe. The Slavs immigrated here around the year 600, but the Albanians are indigenous, right? And being a mountain people, they were divided between a number of different states that really couldn't get along with each other. Skanderbeg was able to unite them because in his life, he had been born Greek Orthodox. He had been brought into the Islamic system, similar to Vlad the Impaler, right? He was brought in as a child and converted to Islam. And when he grew up, he returned to Albania as a Catholic. And so he represented all three religions in the course of his life of the Albanian people, and was able to unite them behind him. He's still a major national symbol for Albanians because of his ability to unite the League of Ledja and his religious ecumenicism. In his life, every battle he fought against Mehmet II, he won. Every single one, including 2 sieges on his home city of Crimea in 1466 and in 1467.
The only reason that Albania finally was defeated by Mehmet II was that Skanderbeg died of old age. Um, and yeah, that's the story of Skanderbeg. Now, if we look to the Asian side,
one quick thing too, if any of you are interested, there was a really good movie about a long time ago, The Great Warrior. It's like 60, 70 years ago that was made. You can get it on YouTube. And it's the story of Skanderbeg. It's a Soviet Albanian movie.
So at the time of Skanderbeg, they were not a Muslim yet, right? The Albanians.
Some Albanians were
already were. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Some Albanians were already Muslim, and some of these states were Muslim states because they had been Let me backtrack a little bit. Within Islam in Albania, there are really two sects that have historically developed. There's Sunni Islam and there's Bektashi. Bektashi was more common in this time period. Today, they're about even, because there were more Sunni conversions after it had become part of the Ottoman Empire. But Bektashi, we already mentioned, that was from the east, from the Alevites, the Alevis, in the eastern portion of Anatolia, but their I don't know what you want to call them, emissaries made their way to Albania, and their Sufism really convinced a number of Albanians. So you had a Muslim population in Albania, and the Bektashis in Albania were not Alevi. They were still Orthodox Muslims, as opposed to, because Alevi are heterodox, right? They're a post-Islamic religion. But there were Bektashi emissaries primarily in the military, and those are the ones that interacted with Albanians and converted some of them. So there were Muslim Albanians at this point. Most of them would have been Bektashi.
But would they fight for Skanderbeg?
Yes.
They would, even though they were Muslim against other Muslims, they would fight. That's what.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, Skanderbeg. I mean, the reason his name is Skanderbeg, right? That was his Muslim name was Iskandar, right? His birth name is George Castrioti, but but he was called Iskandar, and so Iskandar Bey became Skanderbeg.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. I remember.
So
he's a national hero even now, even though it's right now Albania is mostly Muslim, but this Christian warrior is their national hero, right?
Right. Now the thing is that Albania is not mostly anything, right?
Albania because after communism they're not.
No. That's not what I'm saying. Is that there are the four religions, right? There's Orthodox, Catholic, Sunni, and Bektashi, and each of these religions is at least 20% of the population. So when people say that Muslims are the majority, they're counting Bektashi and Sunnis together.
Right.
Which I think is very unfair to the Bektashi, because then you could just count the Christians together. Like,
Sorry.
And the Bektashi have their own houses of worship. They have their own style of worship. It is a different religion to the same extent that you could say that Christianity and Orthodox and Catholicism are two different religions.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for I'm late. I couldn't get into Zoom. There's some internal server error or something that wouldn't.
No worries. I mean, you can see the earlier parts when it goes up on YouTube, and I hope you follow along now and are as excited as I am to finish. So
thanks.
Yep. All right. So we talked about the European side and the kinds of conquests that Mehmet II did or tried to do in Europe. Now we're moving over to the Asian side. And one of the things that Mehmet II wanted to do very quickly after he had settled the European front was to remove any possibility that the Byzantine Empire could really return. Now, the Morea, while it was technically part of the Byzantine Empire at this time, was effectively self-governing, right? They had their own rulers, and those rulers did not have the dynastic ties or clout to recreate the Byzantine Empire. But there was one area that did, which was Trebizond. If we remember from,
5 or 6 episodes ago when we talked about the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine family that was ruling prior to the Fourth Crusade was the Komnenos family. And the Komnenos family was brought by the Georgians to the area around Trebizond to form the dynasty that would be the Empire of Trebizond. The dynasty that continued in Constantinople was the Paleologian dynasty. But the Komnenos dynasty still had legitimacy over the possible Byzantine throne. And so Mehmed II launched a campaign to bring the Empire of Trebizond into the Ottoman Empire. He first went through the beyliks of Jandar, of the Isfandiarids. Those are two names for the same beylik, and the beylik of Janak. Both of these beyliks offered no resistance to Mehmed II and joined the Ottoman Empire. He then arrived at the Empire of Trebizond, and at the same time, he sent ships up through the Bosporus into the Black Sea to take the empire. There was a lot of fierce fighting inside Trebizond, and David, who was David Megas Komnenos, who was the king. Who was the emperor of Trebizond, sent word to the White Sheep Turks. You can see them just outside the Ottoman Empire on the eastern side, to help him fight the Ottomans. But seeing the size of Mehmed's force, it's estimated that he brought about 100,000 soldiers with him. Even the White Sheep Turks, who controlled half of Persia by this point, refused to get involved. And so the Empire of Trebizond was alone and unaided. However, the Georgians still maintained good relations with both the Ottomans and with the Empire of Trebizond. Remember, of course, that the Georgians helped found the empire. They provided its financial basis in its early days, and they granted it original tracts of land. The Georgians managed to get the Ottomans to agree that if the Komnenos family surrendered peacefully, that they could be brought back as captives to Istanbul, that they wouldn't be killed. And so they were brought back to Istanbul. And we don't know the extent to which it's true or not, but in 1463, there was an intercepted message from David Megas Komnenos trying to get some of the Turkic tribes to revolt against the Ottomans and try and recreate the Empire of Trebizond. This letter was intercepted, and David Megas Komnenos was killed on account of this possible sedition. So you can see at the top, when David was killed, his family was ordered not to properly bury him, but they refused the order and they buried him anyway. You can see on the lower right-hand side, this is the Hagia Sophia of Trebizond. This was the holiest church in Trebizond before Trebizond was annexed in 1461. It was then converted into a mosque. It was converted later into a museum during the reign of Atatürk. And then similarly to the way the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul was converted back into a mosque in 2020, this was converted back into a mosque, I believe, in 2003, but it may have been a little bit later. All right. And for those keeping track of the dates, that was the Asian invasion where Vlad III decided to revolt, right? Because he saw that all of Mehmed's troops were in Trebizond. He figured that would be a good opportunity. Additionally, a significant portion of the Trapezuntine population was deported to Istanbul, and Turkic populations were deported into Trebizond in order to make the city Muslim majority relatively quickly. Now, if we remember when we talked about Iran and the development of the post-Timurid situation, we mentioned that the White Sheep Turks had really created an empire in much of Iran and the eastern part of Anatolia. With the taking of Trebizond, right, you can see in the map, the Ottoman Empire's border is the brown one, and the Al-Khoyunlular, the White Sheep Turks, are controlling eastern Anatolia all the way down to
the edges of Iran. Now, these White Sheep Turks had a negative relationship with the Ottoman Empire and considered going to war with them once or twice. They had good relations with Venice, of course, Venice being the traditional enemy of the Ottomans. And the best records we have actually of Uzun Hasan, Tall Hassan, who was leader of the White Sheep Turks, come from Josephat Barbaro, who was the Venetian emissary to the territories of the White Sheep Turks. He eventually had to escape after Uzun Hasan died, and Armenians helped him get out of the country. But despite having immense power by the Venetian standards, the White Sheep Turks were much more concerned with the power of the Ottoman Empire and on their eastern flank, the Timurids. At the same time, we've also been talking about how in the mountains of what's today Iranian Azerbaijan and the independent Republic of Azerbaijan, both of those areas, we have the development of a new religious group called the Safaviya. And these Safaviya are Sufi Shiites, and they're very fundamentalist in their non-traditional view of Islam. And part of that manifests in attempted conquests of Christian areas in what's today southern Russia. Groups like the Alans, just north of Derbent. And we have Sheikh Haidar being the last of these Safaviya leaders before his son Ismail would come to the forefront in 1501. But they launched these campaigns in order to increase their wealth, as well as they're believing it to be a holy act to conquer these Christian areas.
I printed out what you brought on.
So, in so doing, they were able to consolidate increased power and form enough territory to fight the White Sheep Turks. And we'll sort of get into that because it's going to be directly relevant to the Ottoman story. All right. So Mehmet II had very good relations with Sara Khatun, who was Uzun Hasan's mother. And we know that they have good relations because they literally referred to each other as mother and son, despite having no biological relationship. On several occasions, Sara Khatun tried to stop war between Mehmet II and the White Sheep Turks, but was not able to do this. In 1468, Mehmet II overran the Karamanids. You can see them on this map as Karaman Uluları. They overran that, and so the Dulkadirids were really the only buffer state between them and the White Sheep Turks. And at this point, the White Sheep Turks challenged them by taking an Ottoman stronghold at Utlukbeli. Mehmed II, even though he had good relations with Sara Khatun, had to engage with the White Sheep Turks there in 1473, and he won a decisive victory over them. Historians argue that the primary reason that Mehmed II was able to impose his will over the White Sheep Turks is that he had a combined set of military, right? It wasn't just light cavalry. He also had early artillery and the Janissaries, who were beginning to use flintlock rifles. Beginning to use arquebuses at this time. And this combination meant that the White Sheep Turks were soundly defeated, and they accepted what was called the Fetihname, the writ of conquest, which Mehmed II, as a kindness to the White Sheep Turks, wrote in both Ottoman Turkish and in the Mongolic alphabet that the White Sheep Turks would more readily understand. So Mehmed II also, Mehmed II likes to conquer everything. So he also launched wars against the rest of Greece, conquering a number of different Aegean islands. You can see on the map, he took Thasos, Samothrake. I don't know what it was called at that time. The Turkish name is Gökçeada. There's Euboea, which is very close to Athens. The one lack of success that he had was that he had his forces besiege Rhodes, which was under the control of the Knights Hospitalier at the time, by Mesih Pasha in 1480. But the siege did not break, and so the Knights Hospitalier remained in control of Rhodes. He also didn't conquer Crimea, the Crimean Khanate, which you can see on that map labeled as Kirim Hanlige. And the Hanlige, yeah. Turkish is weird, but anyway. And the Crimean Khanate became a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. So by doing this, Mehmet II turned the Black Sea into a Turkish lake, which is very reminiscent of the way that the Romans considered the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, right? Our sea. In this case, the Turks are turning the Black Sea into our lake. And by taking Kaffa, the key city on Crimea, the Ottoman Turks now controlled all of the major pathways of the Silk Road, with the exception of the one that goes through Tyre, right? All the ways through Turkey, all the ways through the Caucasus, and through Crimea. Effectively, there was no way for the Europeans to get these resources without going through the Turks, which of course is one of the major reasons for the explorations that the Europeans do in order to counter this, right? The Turkish monopoly on the Silk Road. And the last invasion that Mehmed II attempted was in the city of Otranto, which is in the southern part of Italy. Gedik Ahmed Pasha led an amphibious force that made landing at Otranto and besieged the city. After 5 days, the siege broke, and he entered the city, and he slaughtered the population there. It's recorded that roughly 12,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed during this attack. On the right-hand side, you can see in the Cathedral of Otranto, because of course today Otranto is Catholic, the martyrs are all recognized for their sacrifice in the conquest. After Mehmet I died in 1481, he lived for a few months after the conquest was successful. The position was largely abandoned by his son Bayezid II, and peace was made with the Italians. At this time, it was the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Kingdom of Naples. And I'll save the ascension of Bayezid II, which I was planning to do today, for next week, because it'll take more than 10 minutes. So I don't want to hold people over the 2-hour mark. Any questions, curiosities?
This was great, Richard. Again, we had a great discussion too. So we'll open up for questions. Anybody has any questions or want to ask anything? One thing is...
What did I miss? Just kidding.
What?
I said, what did I miss? Just kidding.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you missed Constantinople. Like, we spent an hour breaking down those walls, which is a few hours shorter than the Ottomans took. So,
I'll just watch on
some.
YouTube. Thanks.
So there was an aspect where Venetians sent the ships to then relieve Constantinople, and somehow miraculously that they got lost, I guess, on the way. They never got there.
They never got there.
They never got there.
I mean, one of the things that I didn't address, and perhaps I should have, is that when Mehmet took the city, not all of the Greeks in the city stayed. A number of the leading philosophers and theologians left from Constantinople to Western Europe, which was part of why the Renaissance happened. and that these scholars brought from Constantinople a lot of the classics that the Europeans hadn't been paying attention to, especially in northern Italy, right? Because we do have the translations in Spain from the Arabic, but in terms of the Italian Renaissance, a lot more of it has to do with the people who fled from Constantinople.
One thing, Richard, that also fascinates me, Inquisition. What was Mehmet II, words in resettling Jews?
Mehmet II didn't deal with the Inquisition. That's Bayezid. We don't. I've seen different renditions in English. I don't know what the original Turkish is. Maybe I'll be able to find it eventually. But the line is something along the lines of Frederick of Aragon considers himself wise, but how can he say so when he sends me his best subjects? Or why does Frederick the Great impoverish himself and give at my expense, right? Or
you mean Ferdinand, right?
Sorry, that's what I meant. Sorry, yes, yeah. Ferdinand of Aragon.
Mm-hmm.
They call him wise, but why does he send me such great subjects?
We also have Moriscos, which is the Muslims that lived in the realms of the Spain. Why weren't he requesting those? That was an interesting fact.
The Moriscos weren't expelled at that point. Spain passed laws against Moriscos in 1536, so it was just a timing issue.
I see. Yeah, interesting.
In fact, there was actually a huge problem when it came to the colonization of the Americas because, a huge problem from the Spanish perspective, because you had Moriscos and Berberiscos who were part of the population settling in Latin America, and heavens forbid that the Muslims contaminate the New World as they had contaminated the Old World. So the Spanish government actually took great pains to make sure that the Moriscos and Berberiscos that had been part of the colonization of Latin America were shipped back to Europe. So that way they couldn't contaminate the Americas.
Interesting. Wow.
If I may add, another development, it's a Russian slang, another development out of the fall of Constantinople. The niece of the last emperor, Sophia Paleolog, became wife of Russian Grand Prince, Ivan III, and as a result, the grandmother of Ivan the Terrible. So Ivan the Terrible was like 1/4 Byzantine Greek.
Yeah, no, and it was part of the Russian claim to be the third Rome, right? In that you had the first Rome. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Right,
but also through blood.
Yeah, exactly. That it helped secure their claim.
Well, if you think in retrospect, was the only Orthodox empire that was left. Well, who else was there?
But she was used by Pope because he wanted to use her. She converted to Catholicism under his tutelage, and he wanted to marry her to Ivan III in order to convert those Moscow princedom into Catholicism. That was the idea, but instead she converted into the Russian Orthodox. That's how it happened. Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah. So I just want to open up any other.
Not for the Catholic Church, it's not.
What?
I said not. He said that's crazy. I said not for the Catholic Church.
Any church.
Well, I'm Italian American, so
No, it's awesome. Any other questions? Maybe on
one thing that I didn't really touch on, and maybe I can. While Sultan Mehmet was in power, he reconfigured the Ottoman court to more heavily favor the sons of Devshirme, if we can call them that, right? Because these were the people who were brought. Some of them became janissaries, some of them became diplomats, right? And these sons of the Devshirme had representation at court, but they were fighting against the Turkish nobility. And Mehmet II's ascension to power was primarily at the hands of the sons of Devshirme, and his conquests in Europe provided many more
sons of Davshirme, in terms of the creation of the system. So he was heavily favored towards them and against the Anatolian Beylik leadership, which led to the Anatolian Beyliks losing a lot of authority in the court and losing numbers on the court. And we'll see, as this is part of the slow shift to where the Janissaries basically take over the empire. At this point, the Janissaries aren't anywhere near that, but it's going in that direction. And as I pointed out, Jandarli Halil was executed by Mehmed II, and Mehmed II went through several viziers, only choosing those that sought his fancy rather than because they had the dynastic right of succession, as Jandarli Halil had with his parents, with his father and grandfather being previous grand viziers.
Interesting. Not to throw another wrinkle, I'm sorry to introduce the Bosniak question, but slave trade. So, you know, you did talk about the Shirme and you talk about Janissaries. In Crimea, you know, later on, obviously not now, there was a market for slave trade from Slavs being sold.
Oh no, Crimea was a massive slave trading market in this time. Part of the relationship between Crimea and the Ottomans, Crimea at this time and the Mamluks of Egypt was specifically on the question of trading slaves. These Slavic slaves and the Turkic slaves, mostly Kipchak Turks from what's now Western Kazakhstan, the part of Russia that borders Western Kazakhstan. Those slaves were heavily valued in Egypt, and that was one of the major reasons why the Mamluk Sultanate survived for as long as it did, is it kept importing these slave soldiers from the Crimean Khanate.
Right. Interesting. Richard, this was really incredible. I had, you know, listening to this, I had a lot of, you know, there's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and thank you for having an open discussion like that. Appreciate it. And I know, you know, you probably had, we have a question from, that's just a highly recommended from Beverly. Okay. So what I wanted to do is just want to go over the upcoming schedule for at least December. This Saturday, we're doing sexuality in ancient Rome. You know, we're gonna, you know, start from the beginning of Rome and the famous, you know, a scene that, you know, so to speak, and we'll probably go into Nero, Caligula, Pompey, and we'll talk about city of Pompeii. And then that will be Saturday at 12. Then on Sunday, we have modern history of EU from 1946 forward. It will be Richard and Aaron in combination. So obviously, if you enjoyed today's presentation, it would be just as good, and if not better. This was really great. So I don't know how to top this one, but somehow Richard always goes above and beyond after that. Then Richard comes back on Tuesday next week. He's going to do Ottoman Golden Age. Then on Wednesday that same week, on the 15th, we're going to talk about the Muslim Jesus, and particularly, you know, if you read a description, you know, we're basically going to be talking about how they see Virgin Mary and how they see Jesus in Quran, you know, holy books. And so that should be an interesting. It would be Dr. Sabil, who is imam and a physician. They're not, you know, they're exclusive from each other. More present, he did the Sharia law, Islam 101, and he did the women in Islam. So watch his presentations, and that's going to be on the 15th. Then on the 18th, if people are interested, again, we're actually going to be visiting Whitney Museum of American Art in person. I know they have a new variant out there, but we do want to meet at least once a month in person just to see, you know, how's everybody doing. And then we'll have a lunch and Svet, the restaurant. I think we'll have a lunch first, and then we'll have more time to go to the museum and enjoy it, kind of walk it off type of stuff. And then on 19th, on Sunday, we have a Rise of Qing dynasty. Finally, I pronounced it correctly, Richard. And Warring States period in China. That and then we're done for December. So what is Patty saying? We'll get a notification for the Muslim Jesus. Very interesting understanding that. Oh, okay. All right. So if nobody has any other questions, I want to thank Richard again. Amazing presentation.
Thank you.
And
it's almost my pleasure.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank the rest of you for your questions as well.
Great job, Richard, of course.
Yeah.
All right, if anybody has any questions or maybe have big questions on the website, the type of stuff, let me know. You know, our website is called omnicarta.org. You know, please, you know, join our YouTube channel, and when you subscribe, like the videos, Richard's videos, any videos that you see, and then, you know, and make comments if you like, you know, that would really help us get the word out there that we have a great product here that, you know, and Richard is a big part of it. And we'll, you know, we'll definitely keep going. I mean, you know, so thank you so much. And I wish everybody have a nice evening, and talk to you when I see you. Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Bye.
take care.
Thanks a lot,
Bye.
Richard, and
Great pleasure.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.